Go, go, because here comes the bus. Watch out, guys, the ball, quickly. 25,000 people started that Wednesday knowing exactly what they would do the next day, without suspecting that their entire city was about to be wiped out completely by the mud. Official records prior to November 1985 usually portray the Colombian city of Armero as a model of agricultural prosperity and social stability in the Tolima region. In the photographs of the time, captured with the grainy texture of 80s celluloid, one can see wide and clean streets, bright white facades that earned it the nickname of the White City, and extensive cotton crops that shone under the incandescent sun of the valley. The image that survives in the historical archives is that of a vibrant community full of future. But the physical and atmospheric reality that was breathed in those small streets hours before the collapse was marked by dense air, a subtle rain of gray particles, and an institutionalized negligence that actively ignored the abyss. When the sun began to hide behind the mountain range on November 13th, the inhabitants of Armero were not preparing for a catastrophe. They were preparing to close an absolutely ordinary workday. The merchants kept their goods in the downtown warehouses. Children ran out of schools through the Bolivar Plaza, and families gathered in their living rooms to have dinner in front of the televisions. No one at that moment was aware that they were walking on the geological debris cone of the mountain. Affected by a chain of dismissed scientific warnings and surrounded by the false calm of local authorities who called for tranquility through the church loudspeakers, the city's routine advanced without knowing that every minute brought it closer to total collapse. The last night of absolute normality of an entire population was trapped under the mud. But the historical archives and records allow us to unearth minute by minute the truth of what happened inside those houses before the impact. And if you want to continue exploring stories like this, you can accompany the channel by subscribing down here while we reconstruct step by step the last hours of Armero. Do not let the history of these families be forgotten. Leave your like so that this historical document reaches more people, and join us to review the exact chronology of the disaster that the world preferred to ignore. Transforming a fertile valley into the economic engine of a province, and in a matter of minutes converting it into a huge graveyard of hardened mud, took a devastating human and geographic price. To understand the magnitude of what happened in Armero, it is necessary to strip the story of any melodramatic filter and analyze the cold infrastructure of the environment. The city thrived thanks to a black and rich land fed by the same volcanic sediments that years later would sign its death sentence. The Nevado del Ruiz, located almost 50 kilometers away, high in the mountains, was perceived by the locals as a harmless ice giant, a static element of the landscape that decorated the horizon and had not recorded a major eruption in over 60 years. Living in Armero in 1985 meant living with a geological time bomb whose fuse had already been lit months before. The epicenter of this clash between daily life and nature was the city's urban center. Armero did not have large skyscrapers or complex metropolitan infrastructures. It was a horizontal city of one-story houses with clay tile roofs and large internal patios. Designed to mitigate the suffocating tropical heat, local commerce was bustling with money from cotton and rice harvests, attracting workers from all over the region and consolidating a population of more than 25,000 inhabitants. However, this apparent structural solidity lacked a real evacuation plan. The streets connecting the city to the high areas of the mountain were narrow and boxed in by the Lagunilla River, turning the topography of the place into a perfect geometric trap if water and earth decided to reclaim their space. What we will do from now on is a true autopsy of the last hours of this community, a detailed journey through the homes, public offices, and streets covered by a fine layer of ash to understand how the psychology of the common inhabitant operated in the face of nature's warnings. We will examine the chain of human errors, the radio broadcasts that asked for calm while the mountain melted, and the suffocating atmosphere of a night where the comfort of home turned tragically into the biggest obstacle to the survival of a town that was about to disappear from official maps. The morning of Wednesday, November 13th, 1985, began in Armero with the same parsimony and thermal heaviness that characterized this Tolima Valley. Business in the Bolivar Plaza opened its doors at 7 in the morning, deploying canvas awnings to protect the counters from the scorching sun that by noon easily exceeded 32 degrees Celsius. Trucks loaded with freshly harvested cotton bundles traveled the main avenues, kicking up a fine dust that mixed with the smell of brewed coffee from local cafes. The local economy was at its peak. Agricultural cooperatives recorded record income, and laborers crowded the supply stores to acquire tools, fertilizers, and groceries for the weekend. There was no visual hint of imminent chaos in the environment. The population operated under the absolute inertia of work, commerce, and long-term plans. The architecture of Armero reinforced that illusion of permanence and solidity. The streets of the White City were flanked by colonial and Republican structures with thick walls of rammed earth, meticulously painted with white lime that reflected sunlight in a blinding way. The houses had high ceilings supported by heavy beams of native wood and covered by baked clay tiles that had resisted decades of tropical rains. Social life took place on the wide sidewalks and in the interior patios full of vegetation where families sat to talk to escape the afternoon heat. On the corners, transistor radios tuned into local stations that broadcast popular music and national news about the seizure of the Palace of Justice in Bogotá that occurred just a week earlier. Public attention was completely diverted toward the country's political crisis, leaving the subtle increase in temperature in the waters of the Lagunilla River as irrelevant data for the common citizen. Towards 2 in the afternoon, the city's routine began to intersect with a series of physical anomalies that the population, due to a lack of technical information, assimilated as simple climatic curiosities in pool halls and bank offices. Employees noticed that the running water from the taps came out cloudy with a marked smell of sulfur and dark sediments. But the service was not suspended. On the outskirts of the city, farm animals and stray dogs showed signs of agitation, wandering nervously or seeking shelter in the highest areas of the urban topography. Despite these tactile and sensory micro-details, the administrative structure continued to operate regularly. The mayor kept his offices open. The San Vicente de Paul Hospital attended routine consultations and the church prepared the evening religious services. The more predictable and ordinary life seemed in those hours, the more efficient the geological trap closing over them became. The atmospheric breaking point occurred after 3 in the afternoon, when the sky over Armero began to undergo an alarming chromatic mutation. The sunlight, which until then dominated the valley, was blocked by a dense mass of dark, heavy clouds that did not come from the ocean, but from the summit of the mountain range. In a matter of minutes, a fine, volatile, light gray substance began to descend uninterruptedly onto the streets, vehicles, and the heads of passers-by. It was pure volcanic ash. At first, the inhabitants took the phenomenon with a mix of surprise and amusement. Children reached out to catch the gray flakes, and drivers activated their car windshield wipers to remove the layer of dust that blurred the windows. The population walked through the center, covering themselves with newspapers or opening their umbrellas to protect themselves from the strange precipitation, without understanding that they were touching the pulverized remains of the interior of the Nevado del Ruiz. Tension began to materialize physically when the ash became denser and more abrasive, irritating the eyes and respiratory tracts of the inhabitants. The smell of rotten eggs, characteristic of sulfur dioxide, intensified until it became unbearable in closed spaces. Despite the tactile evidence of danger, the response of the institutional gear was paralysis and organized misinformation. The parish priest of the church, through the temple loudspeakers, asked citizens to remain calm, assuring them that it was a passing phenomenon and that there was no reason to be alarmed. Local radio stations issued official bulletins where the civil defense and regional authorities explicitly recommended that the population remain inside their homes, close windows, and cover their faces with damp handkerchiefs. This order, issued with the intention of avoiding mass panic on the roads, ended up sealing the fate of thousands of people by confining them to the bottom of the valley. At 7 at night, the ash rain was replaced by a torrential downpour of thick, cold drops that fell mixed with hail and mud from the mountain. Visibility on the streets was reduced to less than 3 meters, blocking any visual attempt to observe the behavior of the volcano or the level of the rivers descending from the mountain range. Street lighting began to flicker due to the storm's lightning, leaving entire areas of the city in intermittent twilight. Community leaders who tried to communicate with the risk management offices in the department's capital found dead phone lines or evasive answers that downplayed reports about the overflowing of water sources in the high parts of the basin. The population of Armero, trapped between the official call for calm and the blind violence of the weather, decided to trust in the solidity of its concrete walls and clay tiles, ignoring that the Lagunilla River had already broken its natural containments upstream. Towards 8:30 at night, the environment inside the residential structures of Armero became a space of absolute isolation and apparent shelter. With the main streets transformed into channels of fluid mud and exterior visibility completely zero due to the intensity of the storm, families concentrated in the deepest areas of their homes. Basic human instinct, in the face of hostile weather, forced the population to close wooden gates, secure iron window latches, and seek the comfort of domestic routine. In hundreds of living rooms, tube televisions flickered with distorted images of national news programs, while in the kitchens, late dinners were prepared using gas stoves, whose hissing barely managed to compete with the roar of water slamming violently against zinc and clay tile roofs. This sensation of architectural security, reinforced by the concrete and brick walls that had sheltered generations of armoritas, actually functioned as an airtight, silent trap. Around 9 at night, local radio stations, operated by announcers who also remained confined in their booths, continued to repeat the official communiques that called for stillness, urging people not to go out onto flooded roads under any circumstances. Trusting these directives, parents put their children to bed in interior rooms, assuring them that the rain would cease by dawn. The intimacy of the home, which in any other climatic circumstance represented the space of maximum protection, completely nullified the citizens' ability to perceive the drastic physical changes that were brewing a few kilometers away. In the upper basin of the Lagunilla River, while the population tried to sleep, the heat of the volcano began to melt millions of tons of ice on the summit of the Nevado del Ruiz. The extreme heat emitted by the volcanic conduits fractured and instantly melted millions of cubic meters of the perennial ice and snow layer of the summit. This immense liquid mass, loaded with sulfur, gases, and incandescent ash, found no resistance and descended the slopes of the mountain at speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour, dragging rocks the size of vehicles, entire trees, and ancient sediments in its path, inside the homes of the White City. The echo of this massive geological movement was muffled by the thick walls and by the very sound of the local storm, preventing the inhabitants from understanding that a vertical wall of debris and mud more than 30 meters high was heading directly towards the urban center. The clock ticked relentlessly towards 11:10 at night on November 13, 1985, the precise instant in which the civil and technological infrastructure of Armero began to disintegrate under the weight of extreme physical variables. The electrical supply had been failing for hours because of the storm, but near 11 at night, the network collapsed completely, and as the high-voltage lines sparked in a rapid sequence along the avenues, transformers exploded, flooding the night sky with flashes of bluish and sulfurous light, and immediately after, the entire White City was plunged into total, dense and impenetrable gloom. In that millisecond of electrical interruption, an acoustic phenomenon unprecedented in the history of the central region of Colombia began to take over the atmosphere of the Tolima Valley. Those who managed to survive on the lower slopes described that the environment was not shaken by a dry detonation, but by a continuous, mechanical, low-frequency roar with a sound so powerful that it made the ground tremble, comparable to the noise generated by hundreds of commercial aviation turbines operating at full power in a confined space, or the advance of an endless freight train whose iron wheels were crushing the very foundations of the earth. Collective panic fractured the false sensation of shelter that the official radio broadcasts and the church's calls had meticulously built during the afternoon. Barefoot, wearing only their sleeping clothes and orienting themselves intermittently thanks to the lightning that tore through the ash-saturated sky, citizens abandoned their beds and tried to open the wooden gates and iron grills of their facades. However, the margin for physical maneuver had been reduced to zero. A first precursor wave of fluid mud, loaded with plant debris and agricultural waste, was already flooding the roadways and interior patios, reaching the height of people's knees and jamming doors due to the hydrostatic pressure of the sediment. The air breathed inside and outside the houses underwent a radical physical change. It became hot, dense, sticky, and loaded with a suffocating vapor with lethal concentrations of sulfur dioxide, which burned the pulmonary alveoli and generated immediate mechanical asphyxiation. This extreme heat was given off directly by the friction of the gigantic liquid mass that had just made its triumphal and destructive entry into the debris cone of the Armero Valley. The Lagunilla River no longer existed as a conventional watercourse. It had been completely transformed into a destructive lahar of monumental proportions, a viscous mass composed 80% of fragmented solid material that included granitic rocks the size of cargo trucks, ancient sediments from the riverbed and the native vegetation of the mountain range, and only 20% liquid water superheated by the internal activity of the Nevado del Ruiz volcano. This avalanche advanced through the boxed-in channel at speeds ranging between 50 and 70 kilometers per hour, multiplying its kinetic energy with every meter it descended from the mountain. Upon reaching the open plains where the urban structure of the White City was settled, the lahar found no topographic barriers to slow its inertia. 11:20 at night became a scene of absolute despair, devoid of any type of logistical coordination or civil evacuation plan, without general emergency sirens, with public and private telephones completely inactive and under a torrential rain of hail and ash. Human groups tried to start a blind flight towards the elevated areas of the periphery, such as the local cemetery hill or the elevation of the cross, but the brutal speed of the mud neutralized any capacity for human displacement. The avalanche entered through the north of Armero with a force impossible to contain. The first houses began to break almost immediately. As if the mud and brick walls had lost all their weight in the face of the push of the mud, many families tried to escape by climbing onto roofs or taking refuge on second floors, while others ran in the dark looking for any high point far from the flooded streets, but the current was moving too fast. In a matter of seconds, the foundations of the dwellings gave way and the entire structures were swept away by the mixture of water, stones, and volcanic debris. The mud kept entering in increasingly dense waves, burying entire blocks in less than 5 minutes. Calls for help were drowned out under the roar of the storm and the brutal weight of tons of sediment descending from the mountain range. When the first gray and diffuse lights of Thursday, November 14th, began to break through the dense layer of thermal mist and suspended dust that floated over the Tolima Valley, The panorama that unfolded before the eyes of the few survivors who had managed to climb the tallest trees or reach the rocks of the cemetery was a plain of absolute physical desolation, a brutal transformation of the landscape that made it impossible to recognize the city, the prosperous, colorful, and densely inhabited white city of Armero, an urban center that just the day before served as the regional economic engine with its cotton cooperatives. Its bank offices and its schools full of life had been completely wiped from the surface of the planet. In its place, the entire valley had become a huge desert of gray, thick, pasty, and steaming mud, which extended uninterruptedly until it was lost on the physical horizon of the valley, covering an estimated area of more than 30 square kilometers of buried land. The urban topography of Armero had been replaced by a sedimentary crust that in the lowest sectors of the debris cone reached depths of between 6 and 8 meters of compacted material. The silence that took over the valley at sunrise was an almost tangible physical element, dense, heavy, and loaded with an atmosphere of total devastation that froze the mood of anyone. The rumble of agricultural truck traffic, the murmur of conversations in the Bolivar Plaza, the singing of tropical birds or the barking of domestic animals that populated the interior patios of colonial houses no longer existed. The only sound component that persisted was the constant hissing of gases released from the hot mud that began to dry under the morning sun, mixed with the murky flow of residual water channels that sought a new course among the invisible ruins of the city. The few reference points that managed to break the geometric horizontality of the sea of mud acquired a deeply ghostly and macabre character. The tops of centennial mango and ceiba trees appeared stripped completely of their leaves and smaller branches, exhibiting twisted trunks covered by a film of cemented ash that testified to the violence of the lahar's impact. In certain quadrants of the former residential zone, the upper corners of two-level concrete buildings protruded just a few centimeters above the gray surface, revealing the true depth of the mechanical burial the population had suffered. The most heartbreaking and unequivocal symbol of the scale of the disaster was the upper section of the tower of the main church of Armero. The white masonry structure, stripped of its bell and surrounded by a desert of sediments, stood in the center of the plain as an archaeological and mute landmark that delimited the exact point where the community life and faith of thousands of people had been cut short definitively in the course of a single night. The visual impact of the 1985 disaster exposed to global public opinion the absolute precariousness of geological monitoring systems, the lack of a real culture of risk management, and the terminal destructive speed of volcanological processes combined with the bureaucratic negligence of states. The rich agricultural plain of Tolima had been transformed, without a transition process, into the most extensive, dense, and concentrated graveyard in the history of the modern Andean region, a huge geological deposit where material memory, historical archives, civil properties, and the remains of more than 20,000 people were fused into a single mass of hardened mud. Those who contemplated the scene from the high slopes understood, in the midst of psychological shock, that international logistical operations would under no circumstances focus on the reconstruction of urban infrastructure or the rescue of material goods of the White City. Armero was no longer a community that could be rebuilt or relocated on the map, but a huge territorial mass grave that would force the entire world to rethink the limits of survival in the face of the awakening of the ice giants of the mountain range. The visual and documentary reconstruction of the last hours of Armero factually and definitively destroys any attempt to treat this catastrophe as an unpredictable or purely inevitable event. The White City did not fall due to the sudden impact of a phenomenon foreign to its own geography. It fell due to a lethal combination between the thermodynamic fury of the Nevado del Ruiz and a chain of human and institutional decisions marked by misinformation, negligence, and the systematic call to a false calm that immobilized the population inside their own homes. The inhabitants of Armero were not characters in a fictional narrative or abstract figures in a risk management report. They were men, women, and children who operated under the logical inertia of normality, daily work, and trust in the structures of their environment, ignoring that biological and geological time was running out under their feet at an irreversible speed. When we observe the archival images or the representations that unearth the daily life of that November 13th, 1985, we are not performing a simple exercise in historical nostalgia. We are witnessing the anatomy of human fragility in the face of the blind dynamics of nature. Those families who shared dinner in the gloom of their living rooms in front of tube televisions, the merchants who squared their cotton accounts in logbooks, and the announcers who asked for tranquility through the microphone were devoured by a physical reality that gave no room for respite or political negotiation. What lies beneath the plain of hardened mud in Tolima is not just the memory of a prosperous city that disappeared in an instant, but a perennial warning about the urgent need to listen to the warnings of the earth before the gates of the abyss open again. If this meticulous, sensory, and documented journey through the corridors of the last day of Armero's existence changed your perspective on the vulnerability of our own cities in the face of the forces of nature, do not close this archive without leaving your stance in the comment section. Comment down here which element of this countdown caused you the greatest impact. the subtle and misunderstood rain of ash that covered the roofs in the afternoon, the administrative silence of local authorities who insisted on calm, or the physical trap that the homes became during the night of the storm. And if you want us to continue reconstructing stories like this, you can support this work by subscribing to the channel and leaving in the comments what other historical episode you would like to see in future reconstructions.